Today I will be doing my refutation speech on Victor's claim of fact, which is many advantages would occur from the legalization of marijuana in California. My response to his first secondary claim is that both examples state that billions were spent to fight the war on drugs, but he doesn't specify specifically where he got the sum of 13.7 billion, so we're just assuming that he's subtracting from somewhere, but we don't really know from where. And also his first examples are really confusing because instead of focusing on the economic factors, Victor could have mentioned how legalizing marijuana could lower arrests. And then my counterclaim is that legalizing marijuana in the market brings social problems, and my first example is how a husband who ate edible marijuana began to hallucinate and actually murdered his wife and children, and his wife called the 911 before he killed them. And then my second example is how in the year that marijuana was legalized in Colorado, 9 children were actually taken to the clinic because they were overdosing on edibles. And before marijuana was legalized, that wasn't happening. Now, moving on to my response to his second claim. His evidence was not strong enough to show a direct link that legalizing marijuana has on lowering crime rates. The speaker suggests to the audience that people would be too high to commit crimes, and roughly 10% of Washington state drivers involved in fatal car crashes between 2010 and 2014 tested positive for recent marijuana intake. So legalizing marijuana would actually increase the number of traffic accidents that would occur. And also the Washington Post informed that out of 462 fatal crashes, 85 drivers tested positive for taking marijuana. And marijuana does impair the drivers, so it's kind of like drunk driving. And now moving on to my response to his third claim. In the speech, the speaker said that the tax revenue for the state would be in the millions and each state has a deficit of billions. Saying millions of billions isn't it's not specific enough because he didn't give an exact number of how many millions and out of how many billions. And for legalizing marijuana wouldn't be the only ways that the state would increase revenues. There are other ways, such as increasing taxes on cigarettes and also increasing the amount of clean energy that California would use that could replace legalizing marijuana instead. And for my counterclaim, the tax revenue raised on marijuana would not be enough to significantly reduce California's deficit because it's only a small percentage. In the state of Colorado, actually, the tax sales only increased 0.5%. So that means that it wouldn't actually make much of a difference on the deficit of the state of California, since it didn't really impact Colorado much. And those were all of my points.
Sounds really costly. Did you literally while you're out? But I honestly, they're hard here.
Yeah, maybe one more time. Yeah, really far away.
All right. You clearly labeled the main proposition. There's no preview of what the supporting points are, but you do label them as you get to the individual points. I wasn't quite clear what the first point was, and the source of your argument is basically about the source of the statistic about how much money is involved. That's a reasonable press to make, although I'm not exactly sure how important it is. The assumption here is that if we weren't spending money on drug interdiction, we'd save billions of dollars. But I don't remember how specific the information was to marijuana. I think that might have been a question that you could ask. I think it's a press that you have, which is a reason to maybe have some hesitancy to accept the advocate's conclusion, but it's not a very strong argument against that particular point. So I think you need to have a little bit more there. You do make an argument that says he focuses on the economic factors instead of some of the other factors like law enforcement costs. That sounds like maybe an amendment to his argument. Here's something else that he could have argued instead of maybe making a counterclaim from your own position. I think that's probably the wrong direction to go. That sounds a little bit more like a criticism of his argument and a suggestion about how to fix it rather than a response to the argument. So you want to be careful about that because that's not really what you're doing here. On the second point, when you talked about social, right, it's not the second point, it's your second point on that first point, that there are going to be social problems that occur as a result of this. I think you've got some good dramatic examples, but you want to give us a source on this. You mentioned a husband who killed his wife and children, because he's, overdosing or using these edibles. This sounds like it's probably a case where somebody has made this inference. You should tell us who made this inference. You should give us a source citation on that because it's, I'm sure a lot of people would say the fact that he was using edibles doesn't necessarily mean that that's what caused him to commit these particular crimes. But if the police attribute it to that, for instance, and that's what's in the official report, then I think you've got a better argument. But you're not really quoting it directly. You're just kind of making a vague reference to a case that you apparently read about. The same thing, you've got a good piece of factual data about the number of kids in Colorado who have OD'd on edibles in this particular place, and they didn't have any of this problem beforehand. So obviously there has been a problem with these sorts of things. I think there's a good argument to be made that there's all sorts of social issues that come up because of legalization of marijuana in places like Colorado and Washington, but you need to be a little bit more forceful in making that argument. You just seem like you've got a couple of random examples instead of a developed counterclaim on that particular point. The second point talks about the impact on crime, and in essence, your argument is that it's a counterclaim that says we're likely to have the opposite effect because people are going to be committing other crimes, primarily DUI type crimes, driving under the influence sorts of things. And you've got some information from Washington, and you've got a statistic about the number of people who are involved in these deaths. And you make the argument that says it's basically impaired driving, it's like drunk driving. And I think those are very reasonable arguments. I think it could be made a little bit more forcefully. It doesn't really talk about whatever argument the advocate made. It's basically a counterclaim. So if the argument that the advocate made suggested that, I remember what the argument was, that we'd all be too high to commit crimes. Yeah, I think there's a better argument on that one. I think the idea that people who are high can't commit crimes is a misnomer. You've got a good argument here, though, that suggests that there are other consequences. I like that argument. I just think there's some more argument to be made there. Then the third argument is about, again, what the tax revenues are. And mostly you're just kind of diminishing this argument about how significant this would be and suggesting that it would not be particularly significant. I think that that's okay. Suggesting that there are alternative ways to get this, that's, I think, pretty reasonable. We're almost on the brink of a policy argument here because we're really talking about what the consequences of a policy would be should we do this, or is there a need for this particular policy. Those are both claims of fact, but the way you've developed it here, I think, suggests that there's not a huge amount of money that's available there, at least in comparison to what the states spend or what their potential budget issues are. I think you need to have a little bit more information about what the budget issues are, particularly in the states that have legalized it and are taxing it. So if Colorado had budget issues before and they have no problems with their budget now, that's a stronger argument for the advocate's position. But if you can say, look, they got a 0.5% increase in revenues and Colorado is still faced with having to cut back X, Y, and Z, I think you can clearly say it hasn't made that big a difference, and I think that's a stronger way of expressing that. It's a bit dry and slow. You need to be a little more energetic when you're speaking to us. Be committed to your position and be willing to, step up and make an argument. You come across sort of passive, like you're just kind of reacting instead of advocating, and I think you want to be a little bit more forceful in your affirmation of your position. Thank you.